a warm welcome to this Bookworm Literary Festival event. Sorry they were a little bit late. It's delighted to see that China and history is such a hot topic, and we've got a packed house tonight. Before we proceed, can we please ask everyone to turn off any phones and buzzing devices? Thank you for that. Tonight the session is Writing China Through History, and we have Dean Barrett, we have Ian Johnson, we have Willis Barnstone, and Mark O'Neill. Would you please give them a very warm welcome. This session is sponsored by Dulwich College Beijing, and Dulwich College are one of our main supporters and have been for very many years. We're very delighted to have many of the Dulwich team here, including the headmaster, David Mansfield. Please give them a huge round of applause for their ongoing support. Their continued support makes this festival possible, and we're very grateful. Our moderator tonight, we're delighted to have Ian Johnson. His books include Wild Grass and A Mosque in Munich. His books and his articles focus on the intersection of religion, history and politics. A Pulitzer Prize-winning correspondent with the Wall Street Journal in Asia. He currently writes for the New York Times and the New York Review of Books. It's a great pleasure to have him. Please welcome Ian Johnson to my right.
So, it's actually working. As I walked over here tonight in a Beijing sandstorm wearing my stylish mask, I thought there must be some way to bring the environment into history. But I realized that then the weather cleared up and it sort of ruined this joke I was going to make. But so forget it. Anyway, so we have three people who write about history in China in three very different ways. But history is central to how they write their books. It informs their writing and translations. And I think I'll just give you a very brief introduction to them and their works. And then each will give maybe sort of a 10-minute introduction, some sort of provocative statement or something they want to say about the topic. And then we'll ramble around here a little bit and take questions from the audience, and before we know it, time will be up. So, first of all, to my left, who will be starting off, is Dean Barrett. Dean has written 20 books about equally on Thailand and on China. He lives in Thailand, has come to China many times. His books are often about the late Qing and early 20th century China, and some are, just grab a couple of copies here, are almost novelistic treatments of history, and one is one of my favorites on a Chinese myth, searching for the Peach Blossom Spring, and also a book on Hong Kong Hangman's Point, which you're going to quote from later. To my right, here's Willis Barnstone, who has written more than 70 books, so we're sort of one up next year. And he's 170 years old, he says. That explains it. I've only written 2 books, so I'm 35 times my output. Anyway, but he is probably best known for translating poetry, but history informs his translations very much. Let me just grab a couple of books here. Including probably one of his most famous translations is the Poems of Mao Zedong, which he published in 1972, and which got him invited to China for a tongue lashing by Zhou Enlai, and also invited back in 1984 with Allen Ginsberg, and maybe we'll hear a little bit about all of these things. And also the Poems of Wang Wei, of course one of the great classical Chinese poets, and these are all very historically informed. This book has a 30-page history or a biography of Wang Wei at the beginning, and I won't go through all of your books because we'll be here for a while. Mark O'Neill, who writes works of contemporary, well, I would say early contemporary history, modern history. He's written a couple of shorter books, for example, on Chinese laborers and in World War I and in Russia, and a book on his grandfather as a missionary in northeastern China. A very, very interesting book, which says a lot about Christianity in China and how Christianity has come to play such an important role in China, and he's traveled a lot around China for that. And a book about his wife's hometown, which is really quite interesting because it gave rise to so many important figures in the late Qing, early Republican era. So you can see we have three different authors who were very much, for whom history is very important, but in very different ways. And so I think that's a really interesting way of looking, of approaching this. And so without much more, we'll start with Dean, and maybe you can give us your...
Okay, yeah, I guess we push this up, right, the button. Yeah, okay. Can you give me those two books of mine? Welcome, and thank you very much for coming. I'm thrilled to be here. I'll go quickly because I don't want to take up too much time. When I go into bookstores, sometimes I see a book and I get an idea, or I just, was it Peter French who wrote Midnight in Beijing? Paul French, because he said he got the idea for that just from some footnote, right, on another book that he had read on Edgar Snow or his wife. And that happens to me a lot. I'll see something and I think, wow, I got to know about that. And in this case, I was in a bookstore in Manhattan, and there was a book about Tang Yao Ming, Tao Qian, and he wrote about Peach Blossom Spring, Tao Hua Yuan, a 4th century poet writing about this beautiful place. And I took it home, and at that time there was no Google or anything, and I had to get a dictionary and try to figure out the characters and all that. But then I decided, when I finally got the poem translated, that I discovered clues that Peach Blossom Spring actually existed. And he had, as a writer, he felt compelled to write about it, but he didn't want guys like me finding it and messing it up. So with these clues, I flew out of Manhattan, went to Hong Kong, took one of the old-fashioned trains up in Hunan, where the tourist Peach Blossom Spring is, and I had to go up in the mountains of Zhangjiajie, if I can pronounce those properly. And then the next trip, I had moved back to Bangkok by then, so then I had to go up to Jiangxi province looking for Peach Blossom Spring, because the poet was born on Lushan up there. So Don Quixote in China, the search for Peach Blossom Spring started because I saw a book title in a bookstore. And it's very much the same with a love story, the China Memoirs of Thomas Rowley, when I started reading books about the Taiping Rebellion, Taiping Tianguo. I also learned that they had an all-female units, warrior units, who would put up a black flag behind them, the Hei Qi, and so that no one of them could retreat when they're facing the Qing armies. And they were very brave, and the Qing, actually, most people regarded them as very fierce. They wanted nothing to do with them. They'd rather fight the men. So I thought, well, what about if one of the Americans fighting against the Taipings was captured by an all-woman unit? That could get interesting. And then I found out that so that's what happens. But in fact, they called them the Silken Armies, remember, because they had looted Hangzhou and Suzhou, wearing these gorgeous silks. And they were Hakka women, so you didn't find the feet of Hakka women. They're very tough. And I found out in real history, as I was writing it, that one of Frederick Townsend Ward's lieutenants had been captured from the ever-victorious army. Ward was killed, and then Chinese Gordon came in later to take the army. But one of them had been captured, but he made a mistake. He got captured by the all-male unit. You know, as Schwarzenegger says at the end of his film, bad mistake, bad move, big mistake. Okay. So anyway, that's just my imagination ran wild on that one. But I do stick usually to the Qing dynasty. And this all started again at a bookstore. I should probably start a bookstore. I was in Manhattan at a bookstore. I was looking through a history book on China, on Hong Kong. And it just one sentence reference. It said something about the baker who poisoned all the foreigners in Hong Kong in 1857. And I said, what? And that started a lifelong quest. I have written plays, film scripts, musical theater. I was working on this, and after 25,000 words of a novel, the characters started singing, and I thought, oh no, not a musical. So I had to leave Hong Kong, find a composer, join BMI as librettist lyricist, join Dramatist Guild, and while I was doing that quest, I came back to doing this. And so I literally went around the world researching everything, missionary societies, university libraries, whatever it took. But when I was doing that, then I went into the Salem, Massachusetts library, Peabody Essex Museum. They have a wonderful library there. And I stumbled upon the Chinese slave trade, because most people don't know there was in fact a Chinese slave trade. Mainly the Portuguese, Spaniards, Mecchanese that had barracoons along the coast, and they would get the slaves, and they Chinese, and they would send them either to Havana, which was a disaster but not the worst, or they would go to the Chincha Islands off of Peru, digging guano, which was bird dung, right? And things were so bad that American ship captains who owned slaves, they were from southern states, they complained to the British Privy Council of Trade how bad they were treated, because at least in the other slave trades, the Arab slave trade of the black, the white slave trade of the black, they wanted them to stay alive long enough, for decades to work. But they knew when they went to dig the guano, they were going to last 1 or 2 years, because that stuff got into their system, you see. And it was really a disaster. And even Cuba, which was in 1875, there were 65,000 Cuban males there, slaves basically. 10 were married. So that's the kind of life that was. But it was much worse on the Chincha Islands. Now the numbers of the China slave trade is much smaller, but it was much, much worse. I just want to read, Hangman's Point is set in Hong Kong in 1857. And there really was a Hangman's Point in Hong Kong where they used to hang the bad guys along the shore. I wanted to just read a few things about the questions, and then I'm going to turn this over to you, but the questions that the Chinese asked at the time, because they had never seen foreigners. And this is why I am so thrilled getting into this period of history when the Chinese first saw foreigners in any real numbers. You had maybe 1,000 foreigners in Hong Kong at the time, and you had, say, 50,000 Chinese. And yes, it's true, the foreigners didn't know much about China, but to the Chinese, the foreigners are really aliens. And the questions they ask, I love them because it shows what they thought. Excuse me. Do you have a moon in your sky? Do you have a sky? Do you have a sun? Do you paint your hands and face white? Is it true your eyes are black like ours, but then they fade as you get older? Is it true your clothes are so tight that when you fall down you cannot get up by yourself? Is it true that your 3-in-1 God missionaries in our celestial kingdom boil and eat the eyes of Chinese children? Is it true that after 4 years on the throne, your emperor is no longer emperor and chooses to live among the common people, the President of the United States? Is it true that your emperor is a woman, Queen Victoria? Is it true that the green-eyed, long-nosed barbarians from across the Western Ocean actually leave their country while their parents are still living? That's a no-no. Is it true your women wear crinolines to hide their deformed bodies? Is it true that your back-of-the-house person walks arm in arm with you rather than behind you? Is it true that rather than prepare meat in the kitchen and use chopsticks, you cut and tear it with weapons at the table? All of the Cantonese were working with the British were usually called Ah Fok, Ah Chi, Ah Mei. And the Chinese were listening to the British while they worked alongside them. And all the British started off their sentences with, I say. And they began to think all the British were called I say. Now, when the British went up to Chusan Island, they took that for a while, but then they gave it back and stayed with Hong Kong. But in Chusan Island, there was a Chinese restaurant, and a foreign devil every afternoon about 4:30 exercised his pony for half an hour. And the Chinese, being a very smart fellow, put up a sign in Chinese and said, "I have paid this foreign devil to ride up and down for your entertainment every afternoon." Remember, we look down on Pidgin English, but we shouldn't. They think that the Chinese actually came up with it because the foreigners didn't learn Chinese. So the Chinese had to come up with some language, right? And it simply means the Chinese were trying to pronounce the word business, okay? They couldn't get it out, so it came out Beijing, Beijing. And if you actually spoke, in those days, the mother of the house would deal with the servants and all that. And she would give a chit, a note or letter, and tell the boy, go do something, go take this. An example is when she would say, all right, take this to the number one topside heaven pigeon man. All right, now topside heaven pigeon man, he knew exactly what she's talking about. But had she said the Bishop of Hong Kong, he wouldn't have had a clue. Topside heaven pigeon man, the man who deals with the business of heaven, and he lives up on the hill, he probably was referring to that. And the servants would sometimes blurt out embarrassing things like, at a formal dinner party, "Oh, Missy, that old man bottom side," meaning he's bald or something, Now, I just want to very quickly read one of the quotes. Okay, this is from the English language newspaper editorial, Hong Kong, 1857. "There is a day of reckoning coming for you, John Chinaman, and but little will be found on the credit side of your account." Chinese placards posted in Hong Kong, also 1857. "These English barbarians, these kindred of dogs and boars, unmannerly, devoid of all knowledge of propriety and human intercourse, wolves and jackals in their greed, lustful, incestuous, bestial, wandering hither and thither, reckless and regardless of all rights, human and divine, like flocks of carrion crows to the carcass." The following quote from the London Times of 15 March 1859. "The sound of the name Hong Kong in our parliamentary proceedings never bodes good to our national interest. It is always connected with some fatal pestilence, some doubtful war, or some discreditable internal squabble. So much so that in popular language, the name of this noisy, bustling, quarrelsome, discontented, and insalubrious little island may not inaptly be used as a euphonious synonym for a place not mentionable to ears polite. We cannot wish that the sea should take it back again to itself, because English lives and English property would be endangered. But if these could be withdrawn, we should be very willingly resign any benefits which we derive from its possession, to be relieved of the inconveniences which it forces upon us." So even the people at the time living in Hong Kong admitted that remember, this was still a dangerous time, 1857. You had piratical fleets, you had people at night trying to take your head off. They could scamper across the harbor and sell it maybe for 500 silver dollars. And a lot of people would always have a pistol when they went out. But if you think the British pulled together, no, not at all. They were complaining themselves that there were more cliques at that time in Hong Kong, and you always had to have a letter of introduction. If you arrived in Hong Kong without a letter of introduction to somebody who counted, you were finished. In fact, one Englishman went down to Australia with a letter of introduction, and he gave it to the Aussie guy, and the guy just laughed and laughed. Oh, it was the funniest thing in the world. Just different customs. I'll stop there.
The ways that people misunderstand each other, especially when you read the way the Chinese do the foreigners read the Chinese and so on, which you see continuing today. Willis, how is history? How is it informed?
I think I have some water. Choose that demonstration. Sure.
I am very unprepared. I thought I was going to, God knows what I thought. But the idea of history has always intrigued me for perverse reasons. For example, I'm very interested in anti-history. Anti-history is anti-historia, as Miguel de Unamuno said, or as Marot talks about his anti-memoir, or in Latin America, maybe the best poet is Nicanor Parra, who wrote some famous books which were his anti-poesias. So Borges, whom I was lucky to know for 18 years, lent me a little passage for a book I did called The Other Bible. And it's largely about the Gnostics and similar intertestamental scriptures. And it says approximately, had the Gnostics won instead of the Romans, these ideas, which we now think are mysterious, lost in light, by somewhat crazy people who believe in the impossible, in the invisible, would be perfectly normal. And I think the winners make history, as we know. We always think of Constantine the Great. Constantinos as the man who founded Christianity. If we, the Roman emperor who saw the cross in the sky. He was actually, and every other Greek, I'm very fond of Greece where I spent many years. It's called Constantinos, but Constantinos killed his mother, and he killed his wife by boiling her in water. And just the last year of his life, he killed his one son. And as far as being the first Christian emperor, well, I guess on his deathbed he converted, but to Arianism, which is another kind of Christianity as opposed to Orthodoxy. And the Arians and the Orthodox were at war for many, many years. So that's the side of history that would be known to us all if he was an awful enemy instead of the great creator of Christianity in Byzantium. I should try to come back to China. When I found this awful translation of the poems of Mao in Chinglish, which made no sense, put out by the foreign language press, I thought there must be a good poet behind it. And I didn't care for Maoism, but I do care for poetry. And when you have been dealing with words all your life, you can recognize whether the poet is good or bad in any translation. You realize it's just, if someone does a terrible translation of Catullus, I think anybody would realize it's a bad translation, but here's a great poet. Well, that was my opinion about Mao. And so I got together with one of my graduate students and asked him to be a human dictionary. And then I did the research. And I did a lot of research. And it was kind of all an amazing big story. And then finally, Nixon, that happened. The book came out suddenly in 11 days, though I had given it to them. But they said, we'll get back to you soon, Willis. But it came out when Nixon was going to China. It became very efficient. And put out this lovely edition, Book of the Month, 5-page review, New York Times, the whole pizzazz. And I, out of total naivete, since there was not a single American journalist in China for over 10 years. I sent a telegram to Zhou Enlai, Beijing, China. I'm the translator of the poems of Mao, and I'd like to visit China. But in the morning came a reply saying, go to Ontario and pick up your visa. So that is why you're speaking to this person now in my Shanghai jacket. People always ask me more often than one changes one's underwear, why did you translate Mao? That's part of the answer. And do you think he's any good? Well, maybe not as a person, not as a leader, but I do think he is quite a marvelous poet, a traditional poet. He would not, like other people, write in that manner. And however, in order to do his poetry, he was all his life reading. On the Long March, he had always the 4 classical novels in his back sack. Whatever he was, they say no one could understand him because his Hunan Chinese was so bad. He was a fine poet. I don't know if that's what I can say about history, but anything else you want to know perhaps can come forth in the discussion.
Well, compared to these two gentlemen, I'm a baby. I've only written 7 books, and 3 of them were commissioned, and 2 of the commissioners changed their mind while I was doing the writing. So I don't know if that's good or bad, but anyway, I finished the book, I handed it over to the commissioner. He said, thank you very much, we'll call you later. And no, they never called. So 1 of the 3 came out, the other 2 are still sitting in a warehouse, and I'm hoping to resurrect them sometime. But the commissioners were very rich people, and I'm sure you know rich people, their lives are too easy, they have too many things, their opinions change from one day to the other, so it's very hard to get them to change their mind. But I like to write books about real people and real history, and that's my interest when I read a newspaper. I mean, even a newspaper, I always see stories about individuals which jump out at me, and I would say this is a wonderful book. And therefore I find it much more interesting than fiction. And I think most people also love to read real stories about real people. So if I can just tell you a couple of stories about 2 of the books, just to try to show you what I find interesting. One of the books is about my grandfather, who was in Manchuria for 45 years. And by great good fortune, I was able to find his cook. Now, this was 40 years after grandfather had passed away, and his cook was in his 70s, and his cook was sleeping in the windowsill of a bread factory. So to avoid the officials, I went there at about 4:30 in the morning, and there he was sleeping in the windowsill, and I nudged him. And I said, sorry to bother you so early, but I'm the grandson of the man he used to work for. And he woke up very quickly, composed himself. We sat down at the table where they made the bread. I had a notepad and a pencil, and I said, Mr. Tsao, can you recall for me what my grandfather used to eat? So he wrote very diligently what he had for breakfast, for lunch, for dinner, wrote it all out. And I think you can imagine what you must have felt like to have such a discovery. And he noted in his list that my grandfather drank Indian tea, Lipton's tea. So I said, but how can this be? He lives in the kingdom of tea. How come he would have this Lipton tea, which is from India? And he said, well, this is how it was. So every 3 months I had to take this long journey to Shenyang and buy 3 months of Lipton tea bags and bring them back. And then my grandfather didn't drink, so tea was what he drank all the time. And another man I interviewed for this book was a pastor. And he was about 80 years old then, and not in good health. But he was someone who knew grandfather personally. So we sat down and I said, please, Pastor, could you give me your opinion about my grandfather? So he was a very elegant, very polite Chinese man. So he said, your grandfather did this, your grandfather did that. Thank you very much, Pastor, but nobody is perfect. Please, what were his defects? And he was quite reluctant to say, but you know, since you're writing a book, it's not an article, it's a book. So with a bit of persuasion, yes, he also outlined to me grandfather's defects. Well, I won't repeat them to you this evening, but in the end, he said, well, Chairman Mao, as we know, was 70% good and 30% bad. That's the official designation. So your grandfather would be 80% good and 20% bad. Thank you very much. So now we come to the book I was talking about earlier this afternoon, and this is about these 12 people from this place in southern China. And one of them is called Tang Shaoyi, and he was the first Prime Minister of the Republic of China in 1912. So of course, if you're writing a history of people, you want to find their descendants. So I was walking around in this township in China, and I said, are any of his descendants still here? And people said, yes, there are 2 of them here. I said, this is so fortunate. He died a long time ago. So I went to see the first one, and he was living in the house where Mr. Tang was born. But it was very hard to get in. The door was locked, there was no bell, and there was a very fierce dog inside. So when you bang on the door, this very fierce dog starts to bark. So I had to give up the first time. So I had to make some more inquiries, get the telephone number. So I called the number, and after a lot of persuasion, he agreed to open the door and let me in. And I discovered that he was in conflict with the township government who want to turn this house into a tourist attraction. But he, as the grandson, says the place belongs to me, it doesn't belong to the government. So the purpose of the dog was to keep out anyone, especially from the government, especially from the PSB, from going in there. And so he spent about 30 minutes telling me about this. He spent another 15 minutes telling me how the other relative in the township was a hooligan and a rascal, and I shouldn't see him. And everything he told me was lies. So we're up to 45 minutes already, but I don't really need this for my book. You know, what I need is grandfather. Tell me about grandfather. So finally, after an hour, we managed to get the topic away. And yeah, he was very knowledgeable about grandfather, and he was the grandson of his Korean wife. So he told me all about his life in Korea. It was very, very beautiful. But anyway, in the interest of fairness, I have, of course, to go to see the other relative. So a few days later, I went to see the other relative. And his house is immediately adjoining the other one. So I went to see him, and he's about 92. So I walked in, and I said, 你好，先生，很高兴看到你. So he shakes his head and replies to me in perfect New York English. And yes, this man was born in New York. He came to China when he was about 26. So he speaks some Chinese, but not very good. So this interview, unfortunately, was not so useful, because all he wanted to tell me was what a rascal lived in the adjoining house. And I shouldn't believe anything he said, and he should leave the house, and it doesn't belong to him, and he's a hooligan. And I tried to get the topic back onto the achievements of Mr. Tang Shaoyi and his contributions to China and so forth. I failed. So that was an hour waste. So, you know, I just want to tell you these short stories just to give you that sense of excitement and interest when you meet these witnesses to history. Now, about a week ago, I was interviewed by a lady from the Shenzhen Daily about the new book. And she said, well, your book's kind of okay, but there are 2 big mistakes in it. And I said, what are they? Well, first of all, the characters are too perfect. You don't describe the defects of these people. Are you saying they're all perfect? Because, you know, she works in communist China, so she assumed that, you know, I've been to proper classes and sort of been taught how to write history books. The next question she said was, your books are about history. You know, people now want to read about China today. I mean, modern China. There's so much to write about. Why don't you write about modern China? And so this was a much more difficult question to answer. And I thought, well, do I tell her the truth, or what do I tell her? So I said, well, Miss Tsao, you know as well as I do, it's very difficult to write about modern China because so much is secret, so much is not disclosed. It's very hard to get access to archives, documents, especially if you're a big nose like we are. And even when you interview people, you're not really sure if what you're hearing is what they really think, or whether they've been told to tell you this, or they're embarrassed about something. You know, you're not at all sure. And she said, she wasn't convinced by this. You're a writer, you're a reporter, you know, you should be able to deal with all that. So then I thought, well, I better tell her the truth then. Which is, I live in Hong Kong, I love coming to Beijing, I love coming to Shanghai, Guangzhou, I have a teaching job in Zhuhai, I love to visit the mainland. And if you write a book that's a bestseller, the chances are you will not be allowed anymore to enter the PRC. And I thought of the best book in China. And I put top of the list Tombstone by Yang Jisheng about the Great Famine. I put second the book by Mao's Doctor. And these books were outstanding because they were written not by foreigners, but by Chinese, and not by normal Chinese, by people who were at the center of the system. They were inside the system. And Mr. Yang Jisheng was able to go to China where the famine was worst. He was able to see the documents of those places. He was able to interview the officials who were either in charge at the time or knew the officials in charge at the time. He could get the real facts. Now, two foreigners, Jasper Becker and Frank Dakota, have also written excellent books about the Great Famine, and I have great respect for those books. But I think neither can really compare with that of Mr. Yang because they are outsiders. So they did a very good job with all the material that they could get, but not compared with those two. So, in other words, if you come up with something original, that's something no one else has written, something shocking, you will certainly write a good book, you will certainly sell a lot of copies, but that's the end of your visa. So, now, when I said this, the lady from Shenzhen was not at all impressed. And she said, you're so timid. The foreigners I go drinking with in Shenzhen, this is ridiculous. And you're in Hong Kong, you know, and I go drinking with these foreign friends in Shenzhen, and they say all sorts of stuff, you know. What kind of journalist are you? So anyway, I just want to throw the ball in the air because Ian here has written books about post-49 China, and he's here. So evidently what I've just said it can't be true. But I feel that Ian has some secrets, which the rest of us don't know, and that's why he's here. Anyway, and I can't wait to read Ian's next book because it's something that has not been well covered. It's one of the big stories unwritten in China. So I hope he or some of you in the audience could tell me how to overcome my problem.
Thanks for the three great opening statements. And I would, though, say that there's a good reason for writing about, you know, it occurs to me also that you two especially are writing about a somewhat similar era, which is the late Qing, early Minguo, the early Republican period. Of course, Willis has written 70 books, so he's written everything for the Tang Dynasty in an hour. But I think that there is probably a reason, and maybe Dean, why did you choose this era? It seems like from what you read and what you told us, there were striking sort of parallels in terms of how things are misunderstandings today. And
yeah, well, I love history anyway. I love researching history, and I love going down the pathways, the byways of history, and I've got the time that one thing will lead me to another. And as I say, the poisoning case is what started me off. It is the only poisoning, mass poisoning of a settled community in history. Chinese bakery, Yixing Bakery, which means what, propitious or something like that. Anyway, the Yixing, yeah, the Happy Bakery, whatever. They put 10 pounds of arsenic in the bread of all the foreign devils on January 15th in the morning. They didn't know how much to use, so they put 10 pounds of arsenic. Had they used 5 pounds, they could have killed everybody, because too much arsenic in your system acts as an emetic, you see, and you are cathartic, and you throw it up. So there was a lot of vomiting in Hong Kong that morning. Fortunately for them, the people who ate the least bread suffered the most. The baker was put on trial because he had gone to Macau, but in fact, he was on his way back. What happened, as far as my research shows, he was basically framed by the bad guy, the Governor General up in Canton, Chen, who hated foreigners, wouldn't talk to Governor Bowring at all. I think he paid the managers under the baker. But the baker went on trial. It was the most sensational trial in Hong Kong at the time. And he was found, 5 British jurors found him innocent, and 1 Scottish juror found him guilty. So they said, okay, well, you have to leave Hong Kong for 5 years, which he did, and then he ended up in Saigon as a very wealthy, well-respected man. But it is true, you can't quite prove anybody died from it. There is a grave of Sandwith Drinker in Macau, who died a few months later. And Lady Bowring herself, the governor's wife, ended up with 2 bad years, and she went back to England and died. But people died of everything in those days, colonial fever, you name it, especially drinking too much. So it's very hard to tell. Before I don't know if that answers the question, but I do want to get this painting in, because when I say you go down byways of history, I love this kind of stuff. This is the Great Exhibition of 1851, okay? It was the first exhibition in the world. It was held in London. The upper-class English were afraid to do it because they were afraid all the rabble-rousers from around England, from around Great Britain, would come to London and might not be loyal to the Queen. And of course it proved they were really loyal. So what you've got here is the Queen and her husband, and you've got the Archbishop of Canterbury, you've got Wellington himself, you've got all these people. And over here, you noticed you got the Chinese ambassador in his Manchu robes. It looks like he's wearing a ruby top, which would make him #1 in the 9, the most important. There's only one problem. He was not the ambassador from China. He was a juggler on a boat in the Thames, and he was teaching sword play and stuff, and he put on this little show. And we can't look into his mind, but I don't think he tried to fool anybody. He wanted to see the Great Exhibition. And he put on his robes, and he went there, and he didn't speak a word of English. Of course, nobody was speaking Chinese, so they assumed he was the ambassador. There he is, next to the most important ambassadors there. And the reason I love this is because I think it's the greatest example I've ever seen of dress for success. Dress for success and keep your mouth shut. This guy.
Yeah, well, that strikes me. Many foreigners in China today have similar.
Yeah.
Sort of their main qualification is looking the part on television and great geniuses and so on. But let me just ask Mark a quick. Mark, I don't believe for a moment that you're only choosing these areas because you're too timid for the journalists from the Shenzhen Ribao or whatever. I think you chose this era because it's of interest to you, and why?
Well, I think the information is easier to come by. More time has passed, so there's more information. There's more of a consensus on those people, and I'm sorry to repeat what I said this afternoon, but I find the late Qing, early Republican period is one when China was getting rid of one system, she was adopting a new system, she wasn't really sure the new system she wanted, she was not really an independent state, she was under all sorts of constraints by the foreign powers, So the Chinese were sort of stuck in the middle between the old system and the new system, that they didn't really know what they wanted. They had these foreign powers there who had a lot of vested interests who didn't want them to have a certain outcome. And of course, the most appealing people would be the more intellectual people, because they wrote what they thought, and we have more records, we have diaries, we have journals about them, and so therefore you can follow more closely their intellectual journeys. And I'm sorry to go on about it, but once the Communist Party takes power, then people are not free to express what they want, and the media is not free to express what people think, and therefore it's very hard for us to know really what was in the mind of people. So, but I think that was not the case before 49. So, yeah, I think as historians we have a much easier job. There's more material, and it's more of an open system. After 49, the Communist Party adopted the Soviet model in its entirety and put it onto China, and that then becomes the model for good or worse.
Willis, you've written about many different eras and translated many different poets. And I mean, has there been a common thread, or what has struck you, or when you've chosen? Like, why chose Wang Wei, for example? Why? Yes.
I thought Wang Wei was the most wonderful poet. I thought he was like Robert Frost and Antonio Machado. But, you know, as an academic, I did quite a lot of history of first Spanish literature, and then I was in the Institute of Biblical Studies, and though I was about atheist, I did a lot of history of religion, and that's a wild field to be in. And I think in some ways that's the most important thing I've done, and hope it will make a big impact. But I did want to tell you, since there's a lot of fun going on here, I don't know how much you will remember about Muhammad Ali from Albania, who around 1825 decided that the royal family of Egypt should take control of Egypt rather than the Turkomans, who were doing the work for the Turkish Empire between French and English occupations. And so they invited the 200 leading Turkomans to a great banquet. And before you knew it, there was no way out. A small number of people slaughtered them all, and thereafter, it wasn't poison, but they just slaughtered them. And then from there on after, that family, until royalty lost out, was the main one. Muhammad Ali has always been a good fighter. My work in history of religion, since I know Greek, I was a professor of Greek at Colgate, O'Connor professor, I have some Irish connections. We have been deceived by wrong translations. I don't mean erroneous, intentionally wrong translations. But we've also been deceived by texts which purport to be very early texts, like the Gospels. The Gospels could not have been written earlier than, the earliest would be about 85, perhaps John was 125, years after. And interestingly, Paul, who founded in most ways Christianity, he was a Pharisee from the family of Benjamin. He never heard of Jesus as a man. He knew that the Isaiah awaited Messiah had come. He was called Joshua, Yeshua, Yehoshua is the full name. And that, but he never heard of Mary. He never heard of the last Pesach, the last Passover, or Last Supper, as frequently it's called. And very strange. But no one seems to care about contradictions in religion because that's not what theology is about. For example, Paul was a really, I mean, most people hate Paul. I love him. I think that Corinthians 13 is the greatest love poem in history. He was a gallant, gay, early Christian, or Christian means messianic. And, of course, God is listening. Now I'm lost. I think I was talking about Paul.
Well, Corinthians gay.
Yay.
Yes, and Maggie, you got me right back on my nasty track. What I was going to say is that it's often said that the reason we have only male apostles, by the way, apostle epistolaki in modern Greek means the little boy who goes to bring coffee to people. It just means a messenger and a carrier of things. Paul, the ones he trusted most were his women friends. So if there was a problem in a small new synagogue, they said Christians mean messianics, though they were all messianics at that time. He'd send the women in and just read his letters, and you can see that. But no one ever reads anything. Who is determining theology? Women cannot be apostles because Paul said no. Paul said yes, but that's history. That's it.
Let me ask you a follow-up question. For the one-way translation,
Yes.
you did a lot of research, wrote
Yes.
a long introduction. What about for the Mao translation? Did you research his history and life, or was it just reading it that was enough?
Well, I can't say yes, I did in a way, because I had a friend who was the best man at my wedding, Robert Payne, who had known Mao as early as 1936. He told me an awful lot. He wrote a book about Mao, but he wrote a book about everything, and which was very useful, by the way. And I read everything available. Did I speak to people? Well, not really. I had Chinese students, but no, it was mainly through research. But had I not done abundant research, I could not have translated with any integrity the poems. And I'm not talking about because I would not have understood the Chinese, but I really would not have understood the situation and the references. So, yeah. You have to study.
Yeah.
And it's fun.
Says the professor. But no, that was the professor. No, thank you. That was perfect. Yeah. So we still have 20 odd minutes left. I wondered if people wanted to ask questions, or I see hands going up already. Oh, we do that with microphone, right? Yeah. So microphone's coming. Since there'll be a lot.
First.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, Ian, I have a question for you that Mark raised. Given I've read a lot of your stuff in the New York Review of Books, somewhat critical, shall we say, of contemporary China, or analytical a little bit. And do you have any problems getting back in and stuff like that? Here you are, obviously.
Who do you know?
Yeah. How do you do it?
It's called 特异功能 in Chinese, special powers. No, I mean, I'm here on a journalist visa, and it gets renewed every year. And it's like being a tenured professor. You have to commit some egregious crime to sort of lose your post, something like that. Yeah, but that's just the way. It's a funny part of the system, but they don't expel actually that many journalists. Expelling journalists are fairly rare.
Okay, Louisa Lim, for example, People's Republic of Indonesia.
She just left, I think.
But
you
she's
look-
persona non grata, her book.
Once
can't
you leave, once you're out, and you're not up for automatic renewal every year, then you try to get back in on a new visa. It's difficult. That's it. Once you have it and you just renew it.
Okay, but I have the microphone, so. So, well, thanks very much for the fascinating talk. I wonder, because we're talking about history and all of you have researched so much, I wonder, what do you think, each of you, if I have the luxury, either because of your studies, of your research, or because of your direct knowledge of the facts, because you were here maybe in times when I wasn't. What would you say is the most, overlooked fact or person or situation that you think, would help us understand China today better if we knew more about it? And it could be of any time in history. Small question.
Dog one.
I cannot answer that question, so maybe that's a good beginning. Because I, having been in China, mainly, this is the fourth time, but mainly during 3 periods, it's very interesting to remember the shade, the stage of each one. When I first came to China, when you saw a foreigner, when foreigners saw me, they had to clap, smile, and walk away quickly, unless they were part of the official delegation. So I did once beside a railroad track when no one was looking. Someone came with me, and spoke to me in perfect Spanish and asked me about Miguel Hernández, one of the last great Spanish poets. And I was just amazed. I've never been able to explain that. I had some interesting experiences that might be typical of the time. I was asked to get in touch with someone who had been a well-known novelist. I'm pronouncing it wrong, but Ma Chuan. And he had written a book called Mountain Village, and he translated the poems of Hans Christian Andersen. He had a literary review, and he had a PhD from Cambridge. Okay, and he was there at the Foreign Language Press, and we spoke all afternoon. It was just wonderful. Then, and I wrote a book of memoirs, and there's this picture in there and everything else. And then 12 years later, when I came back as a Fulbright professor, he invited me over to his house, and he said, "Willis, by the way, I really wasn't at the Foreign Language Press." I said, "Where were you?" "Well, I was in prison for 3 years. They took me out, had a great afternoon." And then I said, "What happened next?" He said, "Well, I had only 2 more years after that." And he'd been denounced by the Young Red Guards. But I think that kind of thing happened often. There was but incredible stoicism. I think only the Chinese can have that equanimity at times. We were friends with the old China hands who'd been here from 49 on. There were still many of them alive, and I knew most of them, or many of them, because these things, life was very small at that aspect. None of them could live in Chinese quarters, even though they were devout party members, including Israel Epstein, who wrote the books on. He edited a Liberation magazine. He was always, his wife was Chinese, but he still had to live with the foreigners, right? But the next time I went to China was during the Fulbright year, and it was so different. They kept me out of China for a year, because I had won the Fulbright, and I had taken leave of absence from Wesleyan University, where I was teaching at the time. And so they said, the vice president came up to me and said, Willis, you remember you wanted to go? And I said, yeah. When they asked me to apply again, I said, no. I had rented my house, and I took a leave of absence, and you said, I'm going. He said, this time it will work. Well, they worried that I might be a Maoist. And the last thing that the Weibo Yushui wanted was a Maoist in China. All the statues were being knocked down. If you talked about the Gang of Four, they always raised 5 fingers to say, meaning the 5th was Mao. Those were different times. I didn't meet anyone who professed to be a communist in those days. It was like going to Poland when I went once to Poland. I never saw everybody put on robes. Yes. So that was a lovely era. And all the great professors who were there, they'd all been in prison for at least 5 years. There was no bitterness about it. It just, that's the way it was. And now they were salaried. They made $14 a month. Their food and food and living quarters were taken care of. They were living the life of luxury, yes. Then, of course, when I went back with Sarah 9 years ago to spend some time in Anhui province in Shanghai, I was sitting on a plane next to a young Chinese woman who was wearing shorts. You know, and all of them, I would have frozen, but and it was just so. And she wanted to know if I loved. She called it, yes, KFC. And you know, I wasn't hip. I mean, she thought I was really a dunce from the wasteland. That hair grew out of my nose long enough to sweep the floor with. But I know, and I said, what's Kentucky Fried Chicken? And I got to Shanghai, and I saw that at night, when you looked at the boomed area, there was this huge electric sign which said KFC. I don't think it's there anymore, is it? Thank goodness. When I was a kid, growing up in New York, it reminded me of that because there were no buildings on the Jersey Shore then. But one sign came up every minute, and it gave the time, and it said Crisco. It reminded me of China's Shanghai. That it was obviously 9, and I saw all the Pudong. I mean, it was really kind of terrifying to see all the nice but mainly horrible skyscrapers. And now that I'm back in China, I don't understand much. It's full of people like you who would be impossible to think of getting together. And I know a lot of the contemporary Chinese poets. They're wonderful. The arts are blooming. Great novelists, and you know, if you're a painter, Korean or Japanese, you often change your name to Chinese to get more money on the international market. So things are going well. At the same time, it's clear we're moving toward more repression in other ways, and I don't have to. But I think the most disturbing thing is not the fact of intellectuals here. On the contrary, it's a great blooming time. And maybe the fact that people in engineering don't give a damn, everybody cares about money and living a little better. But the city is now intolerable. I can't breathe. I was thinking of Eric Garner, who, you know, was thrown down in New York, you remember, a while ago, and he couldn't breathe. And I had tuberculosis after going to Africa. Well, I'm cured, but I suffered a little tiny bit. And I don't know how people can live that way. It just, and the other thing is, they made these cities, which, I mean, Beijing used to be so beautiful because poverty preserves beauty. Is it in San Juan, Puerto Rico, or in Havana, all these places? But now it's kind of I think Shanghai, which is so beautiful, is worse, except for the great booms in the French Quarter. They've made the country ugly. When we spent a month in Tibet, they were starting in 1985 to put up these terrible buildings made of I don't know what, paper clips next to a Buddhist temple, the 3% that were not destroyed. So anyway, that's plenty.
I try to answer your question. The longer I'm in China, the more I realize I don't know. That's not flippant. That's my true observation. As you know, the country is enormous. It's changing at an astonishing pace. The published public documents, media, television do not tell the truth. Or, sorry, they tell some truths, but a lot they do not say, or they're not allowed to say. When you talk to people, again, some people tell the truth, some people distort the truth on purpose, other people are not are too afraid to tell the truth. And the baggage that we bring, I think is a great handicap. I just give you a very small example. The first time I was arrested in Beijing, I was going to no, I mean, seriously, I mean, Ian has many stories like this. But, I was going to this, it was a protest against demolition of a housing area. So I was walking around, the policeman came up to me, took me to this police station, and thank God my Chinese assistant was with me at that time, because I hadn't been here for very long. And the policeman, there were three of them, sat down and said, "You have no right to be here, you must leave this place." And I got out my journalist card, I said, "Yes, but this allows me to be in Beijing, this is Beijing city, this is not a military area, this is an open area, according to my permit, I'm allowed to be here." And the policeman became very angry and spoke on and on and on. And they put in front of me a document which I had to sign, which is to say I'm in this place improperly and I must leave. So I was becoming very heated. And then, fortunately, my assistant said, "Wait, just get off your horse, you know. Just sign it for me. And then we can all go home, they'll be very happy." Right? No, I don't understand. So, rather grudgingly, because I was thinking so much of myself, you know, I signed the form. And of course, the atmosphere in the room immediately was transformed. The three policemen became extremely polite and gracious. Someone came in with tea and biscuits. We all shook hands, and I went back to my office. Nothing was heard about it. I mean, that's a terribly small event. But you know, any Chinese person who had been in that situation, he would know immediately what to do. He would sign anything or whatever was asked of him, and then the matter would be finished. So that's just a very small item. So the first point is we know so little. The second point is what is in the public domain is only partially true or misleading, or people are afraid to speak. And thirdly, we foreigners, you know, our eyes are the wrong shape. You know, they're too big, or our noses are too large. You know, so we miss a lot. We bring so many prejudices to it. So, sorry, your question is unanswered.
Is it time? Good time for one last question. Yeah.
I have a question. Go here and then back.
Thank you so much. It's absolutely fascinating. I say I'm just a visitor here for a few days, so my question may be completely ignorant, but I see the importance that you're all stressing, which I share, of preserving memory and history being important to today's culture. But I wonder if I could just put the opposite view for a reaction, the value of forgetting. Because so many of the things which have been hidden or kept out of memory are very painful, and can an argument be made to say that those very bad things that have happened may be better put to one side for a generation or so, just like after the Second World War, the French created a history that said they'd all been in the resistance, or the Vietnamese now believe the Americans have always been their friends. And if you look at the Middle East, it's different. So I just wonder, can I just sort of put the sort of paradox to you that possibly the government has a reason to say, let's just not talk about that.
Well, the Chinese certainly, I mean, this is being debated now, and of course the government takes one point of view. Let's forget it and move on. And there are a lot of people who suffered who say, no, we can't move forward until we deal with what happened with the past. We don't want to repeat it and that kind of thing. So you're absolutely right. It's a good question, but I don't think anybody can answer it or say one way is better. Depends on which country and, you know. But yeah, for China, Chinese, I'm sure behind closed doors, government has debated this very issue.
Well, two years ago, I bought the Mingpa newspaper in Hong Kong, and the front page story was on the 7 no's. What cannot be discussed in universities of China, and because I teach in one, of course I have to pay attention to this. And one of the no's was the historical errors of the Communist Party. This cannot be discussed in the universities. Now, luckily the university where I teach, it's a joint venture university. It's not run by the state, so we have a bit more space. And it's not that we go after this story, but at least I feel in our classrooms we can address and talk about these issues if we want. Now, earlier I lived for a long time in Taiwan, and when I was there, it was not allowed to talk about the rebellion of 1947. I'm sure you all know about it. But it was a sore scar on all those families that had lost people. And just to give you a very vivid example, I used to share an apartment with a lady who was a Taiwanese lady, and she fell in love with a Beijing opera singer, a very, very elegant, very fine man. I went to hear him perform. So one Saturday, her parents came from southern Taiwan, and she told all of us in the flat that we had to get out until 8 in the evening. So we spent the day outside, and we came back, and we found her sitting in the sofa in tears. So we said, what's happening? And she said, well, my parents came, I introduced them to the Beijing opera star, who was from the mainland family, and I said I would like to marry this gentleman. And he was not alive in 1947, he had no connection to the massacre. But they said, okay, you can marry him if you want, but if you choose, then you leave our family. So for her, this was absolutely impossible choice. So this was in the 80s, so it was still a taboo topic. But beneath this taboo, it was festering away, the victims were angry and bitter about it, and nothing could be done because it was a taboo topic. Now, later, Taiwan abolished the martial law, then liberated the media and the elections and so forth, and the matter became a public issue. It was debated. The government passed an official apology. There is now a day each year when it's commemorated. They built a museum directly opposite the Presidential Palace, which tells the story of this massacre, and it's very, very vivid with photographs, clothes, shoes, belongings of those who were killed, and the names and their lives. And anyone you go through it, you must be very moved. And the final room is just a large empty room with one photograph. And the photograph says, and who was the man responsible for this massacre? And there's the picture of President Chiang Kai-shek. So this is just opposite the presidential palace, which he occupied and his son occupied for many times. So I walked out of this museum one day and I was in shock, because I thought, how can we have these two buildings so close to each other? And there was a young Taiwanese student, and I walked up and I said, but you can't have this. You have to demolish one of these buildings. And this young Taiwanese said, I'm so sorry for you, he said. You have lived in the mainland for far too long. I mean, I didn't say I was living in the mainland, but he realized, what an absurd idea. Why can't we have these two ideas? In other words, there was the Kuomintang contribution to Taiwan, and then the contribution of these people. So I'm afraid I think the issues have to be directed. And we have many examples of it. I mean, South Africa did it in a certain way. In Germany, it's been done in another way. But I think in the end, you have to address this. And you can't let people die and their descendants die with the sense that their parents were illegally imprisoned, they were tortured, their lives were ruined, and nothing be said, and there'd be no accounting for it. I think if we respect people as individuals, we have to do it at some time.
I think that's especially true in a civilization like China's, where history has played such a central role in legitimizing the ruling regimes over thousands of years. I mean, really, it's such an important thing. I think maybe that's why it's such a hot issue here. Do we have time for that?
Could I?
Yeah, last question.
Could I give my response about that a little bit? Well, I think the question of forgetting is a very tricky one, and it just never is the same. I remember I was in Poland and I stayed with a Polish gentleman, and he was, I better stand. And he wasn't Jewish, but all his Jewish friends were killed. He saw a German soldier during the occupation pick up a little child and thought hugging him, and then until he saw him choking and drop him in the sewer. And he was tortured by the communists, he was tortured by the Russians, he was tortured by everybody. And he wasn't a bitter man, but he said, you know, people of my generation, we can only die, because we can't forget. And then there's Borges, who's quite the opposite. His attitude is always a paradox. During the Falkland War, you know, he had an English grandmother from Northumberland, so he said, oh, this is a war between two bald men over a comb. And I said to him once, we had a marvelous morning together, and I said, you know, next week I'll remember much of what we talked about, and in a year I remember less than 5 years. I just remember that I met you in the Frankie and Johnny Cafe in Buenos Aires. And he said, Willis, he said, and he put his arm in my shoulders, he said, you know what Swedenborg said? No, what did Swedenborg say? He said, God gave us a brain so we could have the capacity to forget. and I think that might be a very good capacity sometime.
I just wanted to quickly ask a question about what seems to be an increasing phenomenon, or a more prominent phenomenon, of books about Chinese history written by foreigners who are then translated into Chinese. I know Rana Mehta from Oxford University, I met with him. He was here doing a bunch of speaking tours about his new book about the Sino-Japanese War. I was, maybe a year or so ago, I was in a museum in China, and they had very prominently displayed copies of Ezra Vogel, his book on Deng Xiaoping. And actually recently, I used to work in the Chinese state media. I did something to do with Deng Xiaoping, and I asked them, okay, we're going to talk about the life of Deng Xiaoping. Can I mention at all him being purged during the Cultural Revolution? Because, it's a bit cheeky asking the question, but it also seemed to me that you can't understand Deng Xiaoping without understanding what he went through during that period. So my question is, what do you guys think about so what I mean is, Ezra Vogel's book on Deng Xiaoping translated into Chinese, there must be huge amounts incised out. So I want to ask the panel, what do you guys think about this phenomenon of these books published in English, translated into Chinese, but obviously with a certain amount, censored out? And how do you think that this might affect the way that Chinese people view their history, and how people outside of China view Chinese history?
I have a lot to say.
I'm in the late Qing period, so you can read it.
Well, the first thing I want to say is my aim is to have every book translated into Chinese, into simplified and traditional character. And Grandfather's book, I'm pleased to say we have the 3 versions. And so people in mainland can buy it easily on the internet. And
Was it censored? Was
very,
the grandfather?
very little. Well, it's sorry to come back to this, it's pre-49. I mean, he left in 1942. And the Communist Party was very weak in Manchuria because the Japanese military was so efficient. So, luckily, he didn't run into communist leaders. There's one communist person in the book, and recently Liaoning TV came down to do an interview, and it was about my grandfather's dealings with this one underground communist. So that makes it easier. It means there's less to change. Secondly, I think this is a very good question, and I also have pondered this phenomenon. Why is it that China, with so many scholars and such wonderful, history and archives, need to have foreigners to write about it? And I think the answer is that certainly until recently, foreigners had much more ease of access to the 3 parts, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and mainland. I mean, now access is much easier for both sides, but until recently it was much easier for us to go to all 3 and consult. And Chinese who read my books, and I'm not praising them, but just to say it's sort of simpler, it's more straightforward. Perhaps we tell history in an easier, maybe more ignorant way. We know less. Writes more plainly. Whereas a Chinese writer writing on the same topic will have more baggage, will have more associations, and will write it in a different way. So I think the Chinese publishers who are publishing these translations, I think they're not doing it because they admire foreigners, but because they think the foreigners are treating the history in a different way, perhaps in a more straightforward way, and therefore they publish them in Chinese because they think it's bringing something new to the Chinese reader. And with this book, which has just come out, when I proposed it to the publisher, who is in Hong Kong, I kept expecting her to say, well, why the hell should we take a book from you about this? What's your special knowledge of this topic? Why didn't they commission a scholar in Guangzhou or Zhuhai to write this? But she didn't hesitate. And I said, well, after the contract was signed, do you mind my asking her? Why? And she said, well, that was her answer. She said, because you foreigners write in a more simple and more straightforward way. And this publisher have many excellent Chinese titles, and they have many excellent Chinese historian writers. So, no, she feels it's different and it's novel for their readers. And long may it continue. And also, I hope Taiwan and China don't become too friendly to each other and don't open the archives of each to the other side, and that the leaders of Chinese Downway don't give too much permission for their authors to go to Taiwan and do research or vice versa. And we want to keep our special.
Anything to add? I would just say it's a great question. It's been widely debated in the American media, at least, over the past year. And I have a piece coming out in the New York Review of Books in the coming next issue or so on Peter Hessler's book tour here. And although he trumped me by publishing his own thing in the New Yorker a couple of weeks ago, this is, of course, censorship is a big issue. How much do you agree? How many changes do you agree to when your book is published in the mainland? And sometimes it's small things, and sometimes they're bigger things. But I think that's something every author has to think about. But I think overall I see it as a sign of progress that there are so many people in China who are interested in foreign perspectives on history, and that despite the censorship and the changes that are made, the cuts that are made, push the envelope, and they are still different novel takes on history or on contemporary society that otherwise wouldn't be here. And so I think that from that point of view, those books are worthwhile. But of course, I guess it always depends on how much is being cut, right? If the heart of the book is being cut out, then you can't really do it. So, but anyway, I think this has been a great discussion. I want to thank the three panelists.